Hey, good morning. It's Patricia Murphy. It's Tuesday. This is Seattle Now. Fentanyl use has surged in Washington state, and that's bad news because this powerful opiate is already contributing to rising deaths here. We'll talk with Brian Mann, who covers addiction for NPR, in a minute. But first, let's get you caught up. King County's first coroner's inquest in 5 years wrapped up yesterday. Jurors reviewing the shooting death of 17-year-old Demarius Butts by Seattle police officers found that SPD acted within the law and department policy. Butts was a suspect in an armed robbery when he was shot 11 times during an exchange of gunfire with police. 2 officers were also shot. The 2-week-long hearing was the first under a revamped process that allows jurors to answer a broader set of questions. There's a new attempt to build publicly owned affordable housing in Seattle. A group called House Our Neighbors filed an initiative with the city yesterday. It would set up a public development authority that could buy houses across the city as well as build its own. Still very early going. Next up is getting enough signatures to get it in front of the city council. And happy birthday to an iconic Seattleite, the monorail. It was originally built for the 1962 World's Fair and probably never expected to be shuttling hockey fans to Kraken games at Climate Pledge Arena. It turns 60 today, and it's throwing itself a party to celebrate. Stop by the Seattle Center station this morning for some monorail memorabilia and free rides between 11 and 1. Fentanyl use is a big problem in our state. Researcher Caleb Banta-Green has been tracking drug trends for the University of Washington's Addiction, Drug, and Alcohol Institute for decades, and even he was surprised at what they found. 42% of people they surveyed said they had used fentanyl in the previous 3 months. That's a 133% increase from 2019. Caleb says the latest survey reveals a complicated picture.
We're dealing with a crisis of unhoused people. We're dealing with a crisis of COVID, and we're dealing with a crisis of this new dangerous form of opioid, of fentanyl, all simultaneously. And that is a really kind of scary mix. It's scary for the people who are using these substances, and it creates, can create a lot of sort of chaos and visible use out in the community.
He says fentanyl began to turn up here around 2016. By then, it had already been circulating on the East Coast for 3 years.
And the fentanyl overdose death rate has been quite a bit higher in the East Coast than it has out here. And we are slowly catching up. So we're really kind of behind where a lot of the country is, which is really a scary prospect, given how high our death rates are already.
Visible drug use downtown gets a lot of attention, but Caleb says this is much more widespread.
This is really affecting people across Seattle, across King County, across Washington state, across all sorts of neighborhoods. And I think folks feel like if we kind of ignore this or are hostile to people, that the problem's going to go away.
Like we mentioned earlier, fentanyl use is a national problem. NPR's Brian Mann covers addiction, and he says unlike other opiates, fentanyl is synthetic. It can be produced virtually anywhere and cheaply. And fentanyl is filling a void left when states began cracking down on overprescribing of prescription painkillers.
I think most public health experts agree that drug companies, the big pharma, really opened the gate to this epidemic by pushing the aggressive use of prescription painkillers back in the late 90s, the early 2000s. What we've seen then is a crackdown on that, and the number of prescription opioids being handed out to patients has declined in most parts of the country pretty dramatically. But, the opioid epidemic doesn't go away because of that. People who are profoundly addicted to opioids then go seek it somewhere else. And that initially brought this second wave of the epidemic with people turning to heroin and other street opioids. And now we're in this third wave of the epidemic with fentanyl coming online. And so right now what we're seeing is the big drug companies still in these legal battles over their moral and legal responsibility for the opioid crisis. That's something I spent a lot of time, covering court cases where we're talking with executives and company leaders. Why did you do this? Why did you flood the market with these pills? But in many respects, we have now moved on, and fentanyl is the new, kind of deadly game in town.
What do users tell you about what they're experiencing, Brian?
It's really a heartbreaking mix of things. So for one thing, there are a lot of people with long-term opioid addiction, especially heroin users, but also people on prescription pain pills who've been addicted for many years, who used to be able to survive and even maintain reasonably high standard of living while maintaining their addiction. Now they live in terror. Every single time they go to the street for their fix, or, they find pills somewhere, they don't have any way of knowing whether this is the batch that's going to kill them. And, you have people who, say, I know this could be the day. And they try to use with friends or around other people who can maybe help them survive an overdose. But that's often difficult for people who are using to do. Now, I will say, and again, this is really hard to understand, but there is also a subset of people with severe addiction who have begun seeking fentanyl. Most people with opioid addiction stop getting the really pleasurable high fairly quickly, and they're just maintaining. They're trying to avoid being sick from withdrawal, and that's really what long-term opioid addiction often looks like. But now what some of these folks have found is there is a way to really get high again, and that's with the potent hit of fentanyl. And so, again, these are people with a profound illness. They are desperately addicted to opioids, and so because of that psychological issue, they are seeking out that experience, even when every time they do it, they know this could be the moment. This could be, the day that they die, and yet they still go there.
It's so complex for people, Brian. And, an expert we've talked to for years says fentanyl's growth is the biggest, fastest shift we've ever seen. And as someone who listens to the police scanner quite frequently, I have been noticing a significant increase in the number of people found passed out in their cars, overdosed. Overdose is a significant risk with fentanyl. This is a tragic situation that's playing out.
Yeah, it's, the numbers, I track the overdose death numbers. And remember, that's just the tip of the iceberg. For every overdose death, there are a lot of other people who overdose but survive. And there are even more people whose lives are being ravaged by opioid addiction. And so what I've seen in the course of the last 2 years is the number of people dying from these fentanyl overdoses has surpassed 100,000 total deaths a year, and that's a massive number of people who are dying. And you're absolutely correct. It's changed the landscape of what it means to live with addiction in the United States. One of the things that surprises people in my reporting, it surprised me to learn, is that most people with severe addiction do survive and they recover and they go on to live really good lives. That's the pattern that's quite common. But it takes time, and it takes usually multiple relapses. There's kind of a well-known path to health. You say, I'm going to get clean, I'm going to get over my addiction, and then probably 4 or 5 times you will relapse, you will start using again, and with the right support, you'll eventually get through that. Only now, with fentanyl in the drug supply, people aren't getting 5 chances. They're not getting multiple, chances to sort of get back up on the horse again. They use one time, they relapse one time, and they can be dead. And that's a very common pattern. And so it's heartbreaking. These are, in many cases, these are people who have families, they have children. The loss of these people with this illness is just tearing apart whole communities.
And conversely, the support of family and friends is critical when you're seeking treatment. And I started covering drugs and addiction probably 30 years ago, and there were very few treatment options available. You had to queue up at the methadone clinic. That was primarily the way you received treatment. That's not the case anymore. I want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, this is a hopeful piece of this, and I'm really glad you brought it up. I mean, one of the things that is true is that as more of our response to addiction has been a public health response and a healthcare response and a scientific response, as opposed to a criminal justice response. Let's arrest people, let's put them in prison. That's what we did for a really long time. And as we've pivoted to healthcare, we have learned that there are approaches that really do help. There are medications, more and more medications coming online all the time that help people recover from overdoses, help people avoid relapses. There are therapies that really work. There are programs that really can help. And one thing that a lot of people don't know is that the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, included provisions that made addiction treatment much more widely available to people. It's almost certainly saved tens of thousands of lives. And so there is a public policy response here that does work, that can keep people alive, help them move towards recovery faster. I will tell you, though, it is really fascinating to cover this and see how often those public health ideas do get tangled up with the criminal justice system. Right now in New York City, there's an effort underway to operate safe consumption sites where people who have severe addiction can come and use their street drugs in a supervised setting. And there are people standing by when there is an overdose to help keep people from dying. And it's worked. There's documented many, many cases where people have been kept alive and they've been helped towards health care and medical care because of being in that facility. And yet it is only sort of quasi-legal, and it's not clear whether that program will survive, and it is still very controversial. So, there are ways to help people, there are healthcare options, but our society has a tough time thinking about addiction as a medical problem as opposed to a criminal problem.
That stigma has been around as long as addiction has been around, Brian Mann. I'm not sure what it takes to get past that.
It's really interesting. In my own family, I had a beloved stepbrother who died of medical complications involved in his opioid addiction. And before I got into this work, I was incredibly judgmental of him. I did not understand what he was dealing with. I did not understand that his illness was a brain disease, one that, was incredibly difficult for him to manage. And I contributed to his stigma. I was not supportive. I did not grasp what was involved here. And I tell that story to people all the time because I want them to understand that I get it. Addiction can be a really, it's not a charismatic illness. It's not the kind of thing where, it's easy when you see somebody in your doorway at your business or on a street corner. That's what we think of as addiction. We think it's a permanent thing. There aren't hopeful options. It's kind of awful to be around as a family member. But as I've learned more about it, the stigma piece is maybe the biggest thing that's causing people to die, maybe even more dangerous than fentanyl, is the fact that we don't grasp that this is an illness that is treatable, that with support and care, a lot more people could survive. And so, the stigma piece is something that I write about and think about a lot.
I really appreciate you sharing that. NPR reporter Brian Mann, great to talk to you. Thank you for your coverage.
Thanks for having me on. I'm glad you're looking at this, and it's an important story for sure there in Washington.
Thanks for listening to Seattle Now. Caroline Chamberlain Gomez produced today's show. Matt Jorgensen does our theme music. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you tomorrow. Everything you hear on KUOW and NPR is made possible by listener and reader support. Make a gift today to keep this service strong tomorrow. Donate online at KUOW.org.